my sweet friends, and welcome back to Crochet Every Day with Judy. We're continuing reading from Swiss Family Robinson, and we're starting with Chapter 42, Discovery of a Crystal Grotto, Further Exploration. We had nothing more to fear from the neighborhood of the boa, but I was afraid it might have either left its mate, it was a female, behind it, or else a nest of little ones, which in time would spread terror through the land. I resolved in consequence to undertake 2 expeditions, the one through the marsh, the other toward Falcon's Nest, through the passage in the rock, where I supposed the boa had got through. We set out loaded with our hunting equipage. We carried besides our arms some boards and the bladders of sea dogs to sustain us on the water if necessary. The boards we wanted to assist us in our march, for by placing one before the other and taking them up, we made a solid walk of wood. This was a great convenience and enabled us to search the marsh thoroughly. We easily recognized traces of the boa. The rushes were bent down where it had passed through, and there were deep spiral impressions in the wet ground where it had rested its enormous rings, but we discovered nothing that induced us to believe that the boa had a companion. We found neither eggs nor little ones, nothing but a nest of dried rushes, and I did not think that the boa had constructed even that. Arrived at the end of the marsh, we made an interesting discovery. It was that of a new grotto which opened out of the rock, and out of which flowed a little stream that passed on among the rushes of the marsh. The grotto was hung with stalactites which rose in immense columns on each side as if to sustain the vault, and formed themselves into singular and beautiful designs. We remained some time in admiration of this miracle of nature, and as we walked on, I remarked that the ground upon which we trod was composed of an extremely fine and white sort of earth, which after examining it I recognized as being fuller's clay. I immediately gathered some handfuls and carefully placed them in my pocket handkerchief. "Here," said I to my sons, who were regarding me with astonishment, "here is a discovery that will be very welcome to your mother, and henceforth, if we bring her dirty clothes, we will bring her something to wash them with, for here is soap." "I thought," said Ernest, "that soap was the result of human industry, and not a production of the earth." "You thought right. The soap that is ordinarily used is composed of a certain salt, the acidity of which is corrected by the addition of grease, and so forth, which weakens its power greatly. But this fabrication is tedious and costly, and men have been so fortunate as to find a sort of earth in which it is united certain qualities of the soap. It is this we have found, and it is called fuller's clay, because it is used to clean woolen goods." We had approached the source of the spring while conversing, and Fritz, who was a little in advance, cried out that the rock had a large opening on one side. We ran forward and soon found ourselves in a new cavern. We fired off a pistol, and we were able to judge by the echo that the grotto extended to a great distance. We then lighted 2 candles with which our knapsacks were provided. They burned without obstacle, and the pure light assured us of the salubrity of the air. Having left the others behind, Fritz and I continued to advance when suddenly we saw our torches reflected from every side of the rock. "Ah, Papa," cried Fritz in a transport of joy, see, a salt grotto. Look at the enormous blocks of salt lying at our feet." "You are very much mistaken indeed," I answered. "These masses are not salt. If they were, the water which drips from the rock would have melted them long ago. Instead of salt, it is crystal. We are really in a palace of rock crystal." "Better yet, a palace of crystal. What an immense treasure for us." "Yes, such a treasure as the gold mine was to Robinson Crusoe." When we reappeared at the entrance of the grotto, we found Jack alone. He conducted us to the border of the swamp, where we found Ernest tranquilly employed in making a rush basket, such as fishermen use, consisting of a frame of long stalks, terminated at the end by a funnel, through which the fish passed but could not return. "Quick, quick," he cried when he saw us approaching. "I have killed a young boa." We had been talking so much of serpents, etc., that the poor boy had mistaken a superb eel, 4 feet in length, for a snake. He had walked straight up to it, hit it 2 or 3 blows on the head with his gun, with as much courage as would have sufficed to kill a dozen boas. The examination that I made of the snake humbled the pride of the victor, but the eel was a great treat for us, and we returned home to Felsenheim. I had as yet only half accomplished my design, and there remained all the country about the farmhouse yet unexplored. And besides, I wished, if it were possible, by fortifying the passages in the rock, to keep out all such visitors as the one we had lately received. I made sure, before we set out, against any accident that might happen. We took plenty of provisions, arms, vessels of all sorts, torches to scare away all intruders on our night encampments. In short, everything that would render our excursion safer and less disagreeable. We advanced in good order along the avenue of Falcon's Nest and discovered the marks of the boa's progress, half effaced by the wind. We found everything in good order at the nest. The harvest and the fruit trees gave promise of an abundant crop. The goats and sheep received us joyfully and came up of their own accord to receive some salt we threw them in passing. We did not stop, as the lake farmhouse was the object of our expedition, and we wished to arrive as soon as possible in order to gather before night cotton enough to make some pillows and mattresses that might render our slumbers more agreeable. The farther we advanced, the fewer traces we found of the serpent. We could not see a single monkey in the cocoa wood, and the crowing of our cocks, mingled with the bleating of our herds, gave promise of good order at the farmhouse, and we were not disappointed. As soon as we arrived, our good housekeeper set about procuring us some dinner, while we went to gather the cotton. After dinner, I announced that we would immediately commence our search, and we divided into 3 parties, each one charged to explore a part of the country. Ernest and his mother had for their division the guard of the provisions and the collection of all the ripe blades in the rice field. To defend them, we left our brave dog Billy. Fritz and Jack, accompanied by Turk and the jackal, took the right bank of the lake, while I followed the left with Francis and his 2 young dogs. It was the first time that the little fellow had shared in any of our expeditions, or had had a gun entrusted to him. He marched along with his head up and as proud as a new-made officer, and he burned with ardor to make trial of his new weapon. But the noise of our steps among the dried rushes frightened only some herons, and they flew so suddenly and quickly that it was impossible to shoot them. Francis began to grow despairing at his ill success, when suddenly we found ourselves in presence of an innumerable quantity of wild geese and black swans, which covered the waters in all directions. Frank was just about to fire into the mass when suddenly a sort of deep, prolonged cry like a bellow issued from the middle of the rushes. We stopped astonished, and a second after the cry was repeated. "I am sure," said Francis, "that it is the little onagra." "Impossible," said I. "He would not leave his mother, and besides, we must have heard him as he passed along. It is more likely to be a swamp bird called a bittern." I called the dogs to my side, and setting them in the rushes, presently heard the report of Francis's gun. But instead of firing in the air, he had discharged his gun right into the thickest part of the rushes, and I saw the birds that the dogs had disturbed flying away safe and sound. "You awkward fellow," said I, "you have let your game escape you." "On the contrary, Papa, I have him. I have him," repeated he with passionate emotion. "Look." So saying, he pulled out of the rushes an animal resembling an agouti, and which the little hunter had already christened by that name. I examined it with attention and discovered that there was much difference between it and the agouti. This one was about 2 feet in length, had incisor teeth like the rabbit, webbed feet, long snout, but no tail at all. "You have killed a rare and curious beast," said I to my little boy. "It is an inhabitant of South America, of the same family as the agouti and peccaries, but much rarer. It is a cabai, and what is more, a cabai of the largest size." "And what sort of an animal is this cabai? I have never heard of him before." "Oh yes, you heard him bray just now, for it was his cry that I attributed to the bittern. This animal profits by the darkness of night to provide his food. He runs fast, can swim well, and has the power of remaining a long time under water. He eats seated on his hind legs, and as to his cry, it sounds exactly like the braying of an ass." But it was time now to return home, and Francis rejoiced at the prospect of his triumph over his brothers. He took up his cabai, threw it over his shoulder, and although I saw that it was much too heavy for him, I thought I would let him have the merit of the whole affair. We found, on returning, Master Ernest tranquilly seated on the bank of the river, and surrounded by a prodigious number of enormous rats which he had killed. The phlegmatic philosopher then recounted to us the history of this massacre. "We were occupied," said he, "my mother and I, in collecting the ripe rice blades, when I discovered at a little distance a sort of high, solid causeway, which looked like a road constructed in the middle of the swamp. I immediately set off to discover what it was, and Master Nips with me. But we had scarcely advanced 1 step when he darted from my sight in pursuit of an animal that quickly disappeared in a sort of hole bored in the causeway. I remarked on advancing that the 2 sides of the bank were pierced all along with these holes, all of the same form and size. I was curious to know what they contained, and I introduced into the opening a long bamboo cane that I had in my hand. I had scarcely drawn it out when there issued forth a legion of animals similar to the first. Nips ran after them, but the rice grew so thick that he could not get along. An idea then occurred to me to place my rice sack over the hole. I did so, and beating the top of the causeway with a stick, a great number ran into the sack. I then began to beat the bag with my stick so as to kill the prisoners. But imagine my surprise when I found myself assailed by a whole army of rats who emerged from every side and began to run up my pantaloons. Nips made most desperate attempts. I could do nothing with my stick, and I cannot tell what might have happened if Billy had not heard my voice and come to my assistance. He rushed bravely upon the army of rats and made so terrible a slaughter that the enemy fled in terror. Those that you behold fell victims to my stick and the formidable teeth of Billy. The rest of the army took refuge in their holes. The narration of Ernest excited my curiosity, and I wished to see for myself the causeway with its inhabitants, and I recognized a series of works similar to those of the beaver, with the single difference that they were not so extensive. I made my sons observe the conformity that existed between these animals and the beaver of the north. Both had the same membrane at the feet to facilitate swimming. Both had the flat tail, and both were provided with 2 little bags of musk. Fritz and Jack returned during these conversations. They brought back a ruffled moorhen and a nest of eggs. We placed them under one of our hens that happened to be sitting at the time. We then all united around a savory mess of rice that my good wife had prepared. She had cooked a small piece of the kabai, but it was detestable, and we abandoned it to our dogs, who would not taste the flesh of the rats on account of the smell of musk. The repast was a merry one. We were all delighted to have found no traces of the boa, and my mischievous boys showered a flood of epigrams upon the conqueror of rats, as they called poor Ernest. The conversation naturally turned upon what we should do with our rat skins, and it was determined upon to make a carpet of them to preserve the floor of our house dry. Our first care was to clean them with sand and ashes, as we were accustomed to do. Presently, Jack and Francis ran to their knapsacks. "Look here, sir," said the youngest as he threw some pine cones before the philosopher. "Look here, sir," said Jack, placing on the table some little shining apples of a pale green, which exhaled a strong odor of cinnamon. A general cry of admiration greeted them. "Stop!" cried I. "Before tasting this fruit, Master Nips must undergo the customary trial, for I am afraid these are the fruit of the manchineel tree, and the manchineel apples produce most terrible colics." I then opened one of the fruit and discovered that I had been deceived by the appearance. The manchineel apple has a nut, and these had very small seeds like the common apple. While I was showing this difference to my children, Master Nips snatched one of the apples from the table and commenced to eat it, smacking his lips as if it were something excellent. This determined the matter. I distributed the fruit, and on tasting them, we declared them most excellent. Fritz wished to know their name. "They are," said I, "cinnamon apples. I think you gathered them from a low shrub, did you not, Jack?" "Oh, yes, shrub, cinnamon. I am falling asleep," stammered out the stupid fellow. I then gave the signal for retiring. We took all necessary precautions for safety during the night, and we sought on our mattresses of cotton the repose that the fatigues of the day had rendered necessary. Chapter 43. The Pig Hunt, the Supply, the Otaheitan Roast, Ham Smoking. The next morning, at break of day, we renewed our search. We directed our course to the sugarcane plantation, where I had built a hut of branches, but we found it all blown down, and setting up our tent, we resolved to pass the forenoon there. While my wife was making preparations for dinner, we explored the sugar canes, as I thought it would be a natural retreat for the serpents, if there yet remained any in this part of the country. Happily, our investigation was without any result, and we were turning to quit the sugar canes when suddenly our dogs began to bark, as if they had taken some dangerous animal. We could perceive nothing, but as it was not prudent to venture among the canes, I ordered my sons to direct their course toward the plain, and we soon found ourselves clear of the canes. At the same time there emerged from them a troop of pigs of quite respectable size and strength. I at first thought it was the young family of our old sow, but their number, the gray color of their skin, and the singular manner in which they walked soon banished that idea. They trotted one after the other with a precision and regularity that would have done honor to a troop on parade. I took good aim, fired both barrels of my gun, and 2 of the animals fell. The loss did not seem to make much impression on the rest of the troop, who trotted on as before. It was a singular spectacle to see the whole family marching along the borders of the sugar canes with an imperturbable tranquillity. Everyone followed exactly in his place without any pushing for precedence, and on examining them more closely, we found that there was but one footstep in the sand. So regularly did they march. But Jack and Fritz, who were a little in advance, could not let them pass unheeded. Bang, bang went their pistols, and 2 more animals bit the dust. The dogs also had their part in the victory, and each one strangled a victim. I immediately recognized them as being a sort of hog, and as I knew that one part, if not immediately removed, would render the meat uneatable, I immediately set about the operation, and my sons gladly aided me, so rejoiced were they at such a splendid booty, for we had 6 pigs, each on average 3 feet in length. While we were thus occupied, I heard the reports of 2 other guns in the distance. I conjectured them to have come from Ernest and Francis, who had overtaken the pigs. I was right, and Ernest, who soon returned with the wagon for which I had sent Fritz, confirmed me in my conjecture. We thus had in possession 3 more pigs, for Billy had also done his duty. The arrival of the doctor naturally provoked a discussion on the name of our game. Fritz thought that these were the Otaheitan pigs of which Captain Cook speaks. Ernest was of another opinion, and maintained that they were peccaries. This animal is very common in Guyana and South America. Before loading the wagon, we resolved to clean our game to diminish the weight. Although we worked as diligently as possible, the work was not yet finished at dinner time, and we were glad to find in the sugar cane a cordial that refreshed and nourished us. We set out for the tent. Excuse me. But my boys were so proud of our chase that they determined to convert our convoy into a triumphal march. They cut some green boughs and decorated our equipage. They adorned their caps and guns with flowers, and we made our entrance, chanting a song of victory. "You have kept me waiting long enough, gentlemen," said my wife. "Your dinner is all spoiled, but bless me, what a quantity of meat! Why should you abuse the provision nature has so liberally provided by killing more than we require?" We justified ourselves as well as we were able, and my children offered their mother the sugar canes they had brought home. Fritz proposed to regale the family with an Otaheitan roast. We received his proposition, but it was put off till the morrow, as the preparation of our pigs precluded all thoughts of anything else. I sent the 2 smaller boys to gather a quantity of green branches and leaves with which to smoke our pork, and we then set to work. Ernest skinned the pigs, Fritz and I cut them up, and my wife salted the pieces. I piled the hams all together so that the salt would penetrate every part, and we also poured salted water over them and allowed them to remain until the hut for smoking was constructed. As for the heads and bones, they were abandoned to the dogs. Excuse me. The next morning, Fritz recalled to my memory the promise I had made to allow him to serve us for dinner an Otaheitan roast. He began by digging a deep trench. He then took the pig he had reserved for the purpose, washed it with care, rubbed the interior with salt, and filled it with a sort of stuffing made of meat, potatoes, and different roots. When the trench was full of combustibles, Fritz set it on fire, and from time to time, the boys threw in, by the direction of their elder brother, a quantity of pebbles, which soon became red hot. My wife observed all these particulars with a look of incredulity. "Beautiful cookery you will make," said she, "with an entire pig, some ashes, and a hole in the ground. Delicious eating, I do not doubt." Nevertheless, notwithstanding her sarcasms, she could not help giving the boys some advice, and she aided Fritz in giving his pig the graceful turn that roast pigs should always have to taste good. When these preparations were finished, our cook-in-chief enveloped his roast in leaves and pieces of bark. A hole was made in the burning cinders large enough to receive it, and it was then covered with red-hot stones, and the hole filled up with earth to prevent the air from penetrating. Fritz let his roast cook for about 2 hours, and it was not without astonishment that after having taken off the triple layer of earth, cinders, and stones, the most delicious odor saluted our olfactories. I scarcely expected anything eatable, and we had before us meat cooked to a nicety, combined with a spicy perfume that would have done honor to a Parisian cook. Fritz triumphed. His good mother avowed that she was conquered, and everyone proceeded without delay to prove the pig. Some ashes which had fallen on it were carefully removed, and the meat was pronounced delicious. During the 3 days while our meat was being smoked, I had every day with my sons explored the country. These excursions discovered to us no traces of the boa, but they very seldom ended without our bringing home some little addition to our comforts and luxuries. One day, we directed our course toward the wood of bamboo, and returned home loaded with cups of all dimensions, formed from rushes, which we sawed apart at every knot. Some of them were very large, 20 inches in diameter. We also made another discovery the same day. It was that each knot of the rushes distilled a sugary matter which crystallized in the sun and resembled candied sugar. These rushes also furnished us a quantity of long, strong thorns, which filled the place of nails admirably. We also made an excursion to Prospect Hill, but we found everything there in the greatest disorder. The walls of the farmhouse were pulled down and the cattle gone. The monkeys had passed that way and left unequivocal traces of their progress. We then surrounded the hut where our hams were suspended with a rampart of earth, and fortified it with branches and stones so as to effectually to keep out all intruders. and we arranged everything so that we might be ready to set off on the morning of the 4th day and commence our explorations beyond the defile that had been the barrier between the district we had inhabited for nearly 3 years and an unknown land which we had but once entered and then were nearly destroyed by a troop of buffaloes. We'll stop there and start next time with Chapter 44. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.